right? Because the church doesn't, there's no concept in the New Testament of all these literally fulfilled prophecies. They're more figurative. So what he does is he actually uses the language, some dispensationalists will use the language of the church as a parenthesis in the divine plan. All right? And then they further divide the dispensations up. And another problem for this is a problem for Lutherans too, is that, if you have a radical doctrine of salvation by faith alone, through grace, without any conception of the moral life playing into your salvation, Jesus poses a problem for you. Because that's not how Jesus talks. Jesus doesn't use the word grace ever. He doesn't talk about grace. The Gospel of John says grace and truth come through Jesus Christ, but Christ himself doesn't speak in terms of grace. It's just not the paradigm of his ministry. Most of Jesus' language is pretty heavily ethical and hortatory. Do this, do this, do this, do this. All right? If you don't do this, you're going to go to hell. If you do this, you'll be saved. And that doesn't sit well if you're a certain kind of Protestant who wants to remove the moral life from spirituality. Like, if you're saved by faith alone, not by works. And Jesus doesn't seem to fit with that paradigm. So, again, Darby takes a kind of really radical position. He just says, well, let's just take Jesus out of the equation. Jesus' ministry applied to the Jews. All right? Now, so literally, let's look at what he's arguing. He says Jesus Christ is really not central to Christianity. That's the position.
Wow.
That's the position. All right? In one sense, yes, of course, they acknowledge the death of Christ as the grounds for the atonement. All right? But in terms of the actual teaching ministry of Christ, that's not relevant for Christians at all. All right? Now, here's the thing about interpreting texts. And this is true of any text. I could pick up Shakespeare. I could pick up the New Testament. I could pick up the Quran. I could pick up, the user's manual on my Toyota Camry. All right? You can pick up any text of literature, select some passage arbitrarily, impose some kind of radical interpretation, say, well, these words in this context actually mean X. And that becomes the interpretive paradigm for reading the rest of it. All right? You can artificially impose any interpretation on any text you want. You can just say, well, I just stipulate that this part is literal and this part is figurative. You can just stipulate that, all right? And I can't gainsay you, right? I can't contradict that. If I tell you that, the repair manual on my car, that the first half of that document is actually an allegory for the invasion of space aliens, and each one of those terms stands for a different planetary intervention. Well, I can't argue that point. That's just a stipulation that you're making. Right. And that's the way dispensationalists handle the Bible. They just stipulate, well, this portion has to be interpreted this way because I say so, because I need that to happen to fit in my theological paradigm, which goes to the fundamental problem of the interpretation of texts. All right? The only way to get around that problem, right, is to embed the text within a living interpretive tradition. All right, just like if I picked up a love letter between Tom and his wife Adrienne over there are going to be all kinds of hints and allusions and nods and winks that are unintelligible to me. But if I ask the people who wrote the letters and I learn their story and I see where the text fell in that history, now in light of that interpretive tradition, the text makes sense. That's the only way you can take an incredibly rich and diverse body of texts like the Bible and treat them in any kind of coherent fashion as having a unified story, is if I place them in that larger interpretive tradition. Guess what we call that larger interpretive tradition? The Catholic Church.
Yes, absolutely.
Once you step outside of that, you're going to get all kinds of insane moves.
Yeah. So there you go, Lori. Be not afraid, and thank you so much for your call. We do appreciate it.
There's a yes for resources on this.
Yeah.
There are a lot of books on dispensationalism and answering dispensationalists. There's one that I think is interesting. It's actually not by a Catholic. It's by a Protestant historian who's not a fan of dispensationalism. And it's not just on dispensationalism, but it's on the kind of crisis of the intellect that emerges with this when you radically divorce yourself from tradition, the kind of crazy moves that people make. And the author's name is Mark Noll, N-O-L-L. He happens to teach at Notre Dame, even though he's not Catholic. He's Presbyterian. And the book is called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And it's about the collapse of the intellectual integrity of conservative Protestantism in America in the 20th century. I think you might find it illustrative.
Lori, thank you so much for your call. This is Call to Communion here on